Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulihi al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Allahumma anfa'ni bima 'allamtani wa 'allimni ma ilma. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. So, the sciences of hadith, this is unique really to Islamic civilization. And no other religion, society, culture has been exposed to this precise methodology and scrutinizing. And we saw last week from Dr. Ridwan some of the attacks of the Orientalists and their lack of understanding of this very detailed branch of the Islamic sciences. And we need to be educated in this area to eliminate the misconceptions in the minds of the people. So that is really the purpose of these e-circles, is to get you, religiously literate, shall we say, or at least at some basic level. Obviously, these are your daily practices. Salah, Quran, dhikr and dua, fikr, and included in that is acquiring knowledge. Within Islam, the teaching is that it is from the cradle to the grave. We're always acquiring knowledge, and this is part of that, inshallah. So just a review of what we did last time. We covered the authority of the Sunnah, and we looked at some of these ayahs. I think I gave them to you in full. I'll leave these slides available on the e-circle chat. These are ayahs for you to look up yourself and also memorize them if you can. And a famous hadith about the authority of the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ said, "May Allah illuminate the one who hears my speech, understands it and conveys it just as he heard it, and many of those to whom it is conveyed are more astute than the one who heard it." So we already covered some of this before, and we covered last time, 2 weeks before, or 3 weeks ago actually, the preservation of hadith and some of the process of it. And really, this ayah in the Quran is kind of part of the preservation of the Quran is the preservation of the Sunnah, because the Sunnah explains how the Quran is understood and applied. But we don't take this, like some kind of blind faith. There is the way of preserving the Hadith. We have talked about it before. So I'm going to rush through some of the slides because it's just a review of what we covered before. The main ways of preserving Hadith: memorization, writing, practice at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the time of the companions. And these are the things we covered before. So the Sahifas, the Musannafs and the Musnads, the types of collections, the written collections that existed at the time of the Prophet, the time of the companions, may Allah be pleased with them, and the Prophet ﷺ, and the companions, and thereafter. We talked about Rihla, which was the travel, as that the companions would move away from Medina and to spread Islam, and the people would travel to different lands in search of hadith. And we mentioned this before. And we mentioned this science of validation, or rather criticism and accreditation, Ilm al Jarh wa Ta'dil, that it began early on, where people after the time of the Sahaba were not perhaps as trustworthy, and so their own personalities, their own abilities needed to be scrutinized, and this is really the beginning, if you like, of the science of hadith criticism, or the criticism of the narrators. And we talked about part of that was not just the looking into the abilities of the narrators, but also who they narrated from, and the Isnad began at that era. So one of the first people to officially make the Ilm al Jarh wa Ta'dil a science was Imam Shu'bah bin Hajjaj, and I won't actually go into these slides into too much detail, but you can see some of the other people, key people who were involved in this. And his students were Abdurrahman bin Mahdi and Yahya bin Sa'id, and their students was Ahmad bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Ma'in, and they were the teachers of also Imam Bukhari. And even we mentioned last time 3 weeks ago about Sahih Bukhari. Even before Imam Bukhari wrote the Sahih, he wrote the Tarikh al-Kabir, which is and if he hadn't have written the Sahih, that he would have been just as well, not just as famous, but he would have been famous for this book on which gave a history of the people of the Hadith and description of their abilities, and it's one of the key books people use to refer to for this science. So I'm going to skip a little bit. After the, or even before, many of the compilations of Hadith that you can see on the screen here, and at the end of today, maybe we'll sort some of these out into a kind of grading, because there were so many collections of Hadith. So the purpose of today is just to look through and see what kind of a grading there might be at the end of this. So just a brief discussion about the history of Ulum al Hadith. So initially Imam Muslim, you can actually get an English copy of it in the bookshop. There's a recent one. It's actually a translation and a commentary of Imam Nawawi's commentary of Sahih Muslim. But in the beginning of the introduction of Sahih Muslim, Imam Muslim, he actually just has some information about the science of Hadith in there. So does Imam Tirmidhi, so does Imam Shafi. He has in some of his works a small discussion about the science of Hadith. So that was the, if you like, the sort of beginning of it. But after that, perhaps the first work dedicated to the principles of the terminology, what's called Mustalah al Hadith, was you can see in the screen, and these other people were also involved. And the key one, I suppose, would be the Muqaddimah of Ibn as-Salah. It's a famous work on Ulum al Hadith, and this is also available. You can get it today in the bookshops. And in this book, it's fascinating because he contains a description of 65 branches of Ulum al Hadith. It's a very precise and detailed science, and requires a kind of forensic ability. So we're going to just cover some very basic terms today to begin with, and then some other terms. So as an introduction to the science of Hadith. So just to recap on this, of what is meant by the word Sunnah, it actually has different meanings in different contexts. Linguistically, it means something. For the Muhaddith, they have a comprehensive understanding of the Sunnah. In our case, we're really just talking about the understanding from the point of the Usuli scholars, Usul al-Fiqh, which is that middle definition there. But of course, Sunnah is also not just, it's also used in the terminology of fiqh, Sunnah as opposed to fard, and it's also used in a different context as opposed to it's called bid'ah. So I'll leave this slide up also in the pack for the e-circles. Hadith also has a linguistic understanding, speech, something new, as opposed to qadim, which is old. But with Islamic terminology, we're talking about the statements, actions, and approvals of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I covered this a little bit before. Difference between Hadith and Sunnah. The Hadith is like a what's it called, a single data point. And I got this slide from a very lovely talk by Dr. Maryam Shaybani from Cambridge Muslim College. Other talks about Hadith are available. Other institutes, Salam Institute, for example, have some excellent talks, and some of these are free, also available online. Many institutes are now doing online courses to get into this in a bit more detail. So Sunnah is the aggregate, if you like. And so we don't say, for example, a weak Sunnah, but we might say, for example, a weak Hadith. Other basic terminology that you should know is that the Hadith consists of two parts, a Sanad and a Matan. The Sanad is the chain, and the text is the Matan. I mean, some people use the word Isnad. The chain is actually the Sanad. Isnad is the informing or the ascription about the Matan, but the two terms are used almost interchangeably. And this is a very important quote from Ibn al-Mubarak. The Isnad is from the religion. Were it not for the Isnad, anyone could say whatever they wanted. The Isnad is the chains vary in length from maybe only 3 people to 6 or more. In Sahih Bukhari, for example, the average length of the chain is 5 narrators. The shortest is 3. I think the longest is 11. And so let's look at one hadith to begin with as an example hadith. So in the Arabic on the right hand side, you can see the actual chain. It's not shown in the English, but you can see the actual chain in Arabic, and you can see it's from it says from Ibn Abi Umar, from Ibn Uyayna, from it says Hadathana, and then it says Hadathana Sufyan an Amr ibn Dinar an Abu Qabus, and then an Abdullah ibn Umar قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, and then this hadith. And this hadith is also a very famous hadith. The merciful are shown mercy by Ar-Rahman. And then irhamu man fil ard yarhamkum man fis sama. Yes, be merciful on the earth and you will be shown mercy from the one who is above the heavens. And this is a famous hadith actually, because this is the first hadith taught from hadith scholars to the students of hadith. Because if a person wants to study hadith and they're not able to promote mercy inside of themselves, so they have learned nothing. So this is the first hadith. If you study hadith, this will be the first one, and then you will learn all the chains going up to your teacher, maybe 30 in today's time. So you can see the isnad and the actual matan of this hadith. Yes, so this shows you that it starts at the bottom, Tirmidhi, and these are the people in the chain. It didn't say, it said Ibn Uyayna. We know this is Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So, as a very brief introduction to hadith, we'll cover some of the classifications of hadith. There are many, and we'll only cover these 3. Classifications according to the last person in the chain, according to the quantity of narrators, and according to the quality of the narrators. The most famous classification of hadith, probably the most relevant one. So the first one is the classification based on the final source, i.e. Because not all hadith start from the Prophet ﷺ. If they do, they are called marfu, which means elevated. If they only go up to a companion, then it's called Mawquf. And if it only goes to the generation after the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, successor, then it's called Maqtu. So this is the classification based on the final source. What is the one? I've got a question mark there. Just if anyone knows, what do you think would be one above the marfu? Something that's maybe higher. It's not normally considered in this particular classification, but if anybody knows, has an idea what that might be, above marfu, slightly trick question, I suppose. Well, I'll give you a clue. it is a hadith which looks like this. It's a hadith Qudsi. So the hadith Qudsi is the one which is, you know, if you like, it stops, it does it, the sources, you know, it goes above. It's what the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. So in this one, very famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Nasai and Ibn Majah, my mercy prevails over my wrath. I won't go into this, but you should know the difference between the Quran and Hadith Qudsi. I think many of you probably do already know this, but I've included it in this presentation in case anybody is not sure. So examples of Mawquf and Maqtu Hadith. So this is the first one, is speak to the people with what they know. Would you like that they deny Allah and His Messenger? This is an example of which of the two? This is an example of Mawquf. This is a saying of Ali ibn Abu Talib, companion. And then the next one, this knowledge is deen, so be careful who you take your deen from. This is an example of Maqtu from Ibn Sirin. And the second one is also example of Maqtu, another saying of Imam Malik, leave those deeds that you do in private, you would not want people to know in the open. Now, the other thing is that sometimes a hadith which is actually mawquf is perhaps implicitly marfu. It's a statement of a Sahabi, but it's something which they could not have said on their own. Regarding knowledge of the unseen, something about ibadah where there's no room for difference of opinion, something which they did while the Prophet ﷺ was alive, or if they said this is from the Sunnah, or if they said we have been ordered to, or we were commanded, we were forbidden from. So this, it becomes implicit marfu, something which they did, because the Prophet ﷺ would not have, you know, they would have been speaking about what the Prophet had ordered them to do. So this is some of the technicalities of the science of hadith. Just out of interest, you might notice that so later on you'll see that Imam Malik's Muwatta does contain a mixture of 600 marfu, which you would recognize as, you know, as the hadith, normal hadith, but also this number of mawquf and maqtu and also mursal, which we'll cover later. And this is because Imam Malik was a lot earlier than the later collectors of hadith, and he was mingling. We mentioned last week, I think Dr. Dwan mentioned the teachers of Imam Malik. He is surrounded by so many that it is not necessary for him to, you know, to label it exactly. It came from here and there, and that actually came later when. In later generations, when people had the need to be a bit more precise. Okay, the next type of classification is another very important classification, is based on the quantity of narrators. So the first word that you should remember and know is the word mutawatir, which means mass transmitted. It's multiple narrators at each stage. It is officially defined as that which has been narrated from so many, by so many, in each stage of transmission, that it is inconceivable that the narrators could all have collaborated and agreed upon a lie. There's no fixed number for how many at each stage. Some have said 10, but there are other opinions actually. In one type of understanding of Ilm al Hadith, anything that's not mutawatir is ahad. There are differences of opinion amongst the schools, amongst the schools of just as there are differences in usul al-fiqh, there are also differences in usul al-hadith. So, but these are the terms that are used quite often amongst all the schools. So, mashhur would be where hadith has 3 or more narrators at each stage. And the word mashhur actually also means famous. There are other hadith which are famous, but they're not technically mashhur in this particular classification. And maybe we'll look at some of these in the next few slides. Next level down is Aziz, where there are 2 narrators at each stage, and then there's also Gharib, where there's only 1 narrator at each stage. So here are some examples. So the first one, this first hadith is a very, very famous hadith. This is, so it's not mashhur, it's actually mutawatir. One of the, it has about 70 companions who have narrated this. It has so many, chains and narrators. It's a very famous hadith. The one below, the Muslim is the one from whose tongue and hand the Muslims are safe. This is a mashhur hadith. It's reported by Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, Jabir ibn Abdullah, Abu Musa al-Ashari, and you find this in Sahih Bukhari and in Sahih Muslim. It is muttafaqun alayh. The next one, none of you truly believe until I become more beloved to him than his parents, his children, and all the people. This hadith is Aziz. And the next one, traveling, is a kind of say torture. I suppose it means a kind of difficulty or punishment or difficulty. This is actually a gharib. Now, most gharib hadith are actually weak, and but there are some which are technically gharib, which is this next one. This is a famous hadith, Innama al-a'malu bin-niyat. Its beginning bit is gharib in the sense that at the beginning of it, there's only one transmitter, but later on it becomes, in a way, it's some have described it as actually, gharib mashhur, because it actually branches out. And I have a diagram here. You might be able to see this. There's the first 4 narrators on their own, but actually it's a very, very famous hadith. And also you can see from this diagram, maybe it's a bit small to see it clearly here, but how the hadith, if you like, spread out. One of the accusations last week was about how the hadith multiplied. Well, you can see that after Yahya, many people took it from him, and from them many other students would learn this hadith. But technically it had this it has this characteristic, because the hadith, in terms of classification by narrators, they're classified according to for each stage. So at any stage, if it goes down to 1, then it becomes gharib. But you can see that if every person is solid, and every person is solid in the beginning, is trustworthy, then it can still be, most gharib are weak, but sometimes they can also be sahih. Okay, so this is the most relevant of the classifications, or the most famous of the classifications of the hadith, which you should all know, which are Sahih, Hasan, Da'eef, Da'eef Jiddan, and Mawdu. So I've separated Da'eef and Da'eef Jiddan. Some people do that, some people don't do that. Some people don't include Mawdu because it's not really a hadith. They say at the beginning, in fact, some of the books you might read, they say hadith or in 3, Sahih, Hasan, Da'eef. But I made Da'eef Jiddan because you see there's some type of Da'eef which cannot be, if you like, upgraded. So the word Sahih also means I suppose linguistically it means healthy, but and you might see it as, I don't know if the translations are various. It might say sound or something, and Hasan is fair, but I think authentic is probably the best sort of translation of it. So let's look at Sahih to begin with. So this is a science that, as we saw earlier from the history slide, it has sort of evolved in the sense that it's become more technical over the centuries. Whereas, and this is similar to other types of sciences where it starts off in a relatively, straightforward manner, but becomes more involved in technical jargon. So the conditions for Sahih, the scholars have said, are if you like, 5, and these are the 5 conditions. The first is a continuous chain. The chain of narrators must be connected. Every narrator must have heard from the other and met each other. And actually, some people have slightly different requirements on how each narrator, met. It could, first of all, could they have met is the first question one asks oneself. Did they live at the same time and place as the other? And then did they actually meet physically? And then did they actually narrate from each other? Did one narrate from the other, not just meet? Did they have a long association? And then another level of questioning is, did they actually narrate this particular hadith? So you can see these different levels of investigation are required, which is why the study of hadith is a very deep science. And that's just the first part of this condition. The second one is the issue of the trustworthiness and righteousness of the narrators. They have to have adala. They have to have some kind of they are not known to commit any major sins or commit minor sins consistently, and they avoid things that are considered culturally shameful or inappropriate. And this is where the books of Tariq, the books that describe the people, are really important, because contemporaries and people above and below the generation would describe what these people were actually like. But as well as having reliability and trustworthiness, they could be very honorable people, but their actual ability to memorize or be accurate in what they learn could be weak. So this is the third condition, which is dhabt. So this is actually broken down into 2: precision in terms of memory, precision in terms of writing, because they may be that well, you can see how they actually could be of either of these have to be important, because one type of connection is where hadathana, where the student reads to the teacher, and the teacher reads to the student, and there's other types of connection. The next 2 are a little bit more difficult to describe, and this is where the expertise of the muhaddith comes into play. Shadh means not irregular, not with any kind of anomaly. And you find anomalies when you compare the hadith of one person with hadith of another person who learnt from the same teacher. So when you have 3 students of a teacher, or maybe 4, and you see that 2 of them said one thing, one of them said it slightly differently, then you have to investigate to see where is the mistake, if you like, or there's a contradiction between a narration and a larger number of narrations, and so this is another area which is yeah, really important. And then hidden defects. Now this is even more difficult to see through, where and some people have described it as a coin seller who knows exactly, who can spot a sort of counterfeit coin, just because he knows so much about the people involved, and this might be a case of a reporter who is known to be reliable, he's trustworthy, he's accurate, but at a certain time of his life, when he was away from one place to another, he was not accurate. He didn't have his material with him, his book with him. Or another instance where somebody his house had burned down at the latter half or in period of his life, and he would rely on his memory, which was weak. And so the hadith scholars are able to detect that kind of level of detail. And the people who are famous to find these, hadith are Imam Bukhari, Imam Ahmad, and Imam Tirmidhi, and Imam Razi. So this are the conditions for Sahih, and the conditions for Hasan are almost the same, and they're just 1 degree less. And in reality, most people say it'll be in number 3, where their accuracy is their so memory is not as good as perhaps in the conditions for Sahih. So it's almost there. And the conditions for Da'eef, to make a hadith Da'eef, is if any of these are missing, then the hadith will be considered Da'eef. So that's what we say in this slide. So there is a case of, if you like, a kind of upgrading of a hadith. Something can be Sahih by itself. Something, if it is Hasan hadith, or this hadith, if it wasn't difficult for my ummah, I would have ordered miswak for every prayer. There's a person within the chain, Muhammad ibn al-Qamah, who was reported from Abu Salama, who reported from Abu Hurairah. But this person, Muhammad ibn al-Qamah, is considered saduq. He's considered weak in his memory, a little bit. So the hadith itself would be considered Hasan and not Sahih. But in the light of other supporting hadith, the hadith gets raised to a level of Sahih, which is Sahih li ghayrihi, through external support. And the same kind of thing can happen to a Da'eef hadith. It can be raised to the level of Hasan li ghayrihi. It can't go 2 levels up, but it can go from supporting hadith. But there are conditions for this. The conditions that it cannot be Da'eef jiddan, cannot be very weak. Those hadith can actually never be upgraded. So I'm not sure we'll have time to do all of these, but we'll do an exercise on whether these hadith are Da'eef or not. So the first hadith, the wording of this hadith is actually Da'eef, but the meaning is contained in another hadith which is Sahih. It's a bit more longer hadith. It's in Ibn Majah and Nasa'i. A man came to the Prophet ﷺ. He said, "Ya Rasulullah, I intend to go on a expedition, a military expedition. I've come to ask your advice." And the Prophet said, "Is your mother alive?" He said, "Yes." "Then stay with her, for the garden is under her feet." So this latter hadith is Sahih by Al-Hakim and Al-Dhahabi and others. The next hadith: seeking knowledge is a duty upon every Muslim. Many people have heard this hadith, but it's narrated by more than a dozen companions, 20 successors, according from Anas bin Malik, connected by Ibn Majah and Al-Bayhaqi. But all of the chains have some kind of weakness in them, so the status is actually weak. But there are so many things that in the Quran about knowledge and the benefits of it, and other scholars have actually looked into it in more detail, and there are enough chains of narration to be strengthened to the level of Hasan, and actually even Sahih in the view of some modern, Ibn Hajar and As-Suyuti, and also modern day scholars. The ink of the scholar holding the blood of the martyr is actually not the hadith, but is a statement of the famous Al-Hasan al-Basri. The most detested halal in the sight of Allah is divorce. The majority of scholars say this is weak in the text. But there's a famous hadith that shows you that this is a mashhur in the sense of the popular word famous, but it's not technically mashhur. But you can see that a mashhur hadith can not necessarily be sahih. Disagreement is a mercy from my ummah. This hadith has actually no chain, so there's no basis to the hadith. The technical term for this, I think, is wahi. And love of one's homeland. This actually hadith is this is actually not hadith. This is actually Mawdu. But scholars differ as to whether the meaning might be correct or not, in what way, to what extent. So you can see that all of these, they have some kind of basis. There is some other to them, in the sense of disagreement, for example. There is a sense of an ethics of disagreement, but not disagreement for the sake of it, but disagreement upon knowledge, because you can have disagreement which just which is very lax kind of disagreement, for example. Anyway, there are many reasons why hadith can be da'if. So if you look at each of the five characteristics of Sahih, each one of them we can break down. So just looking at the first one, you might come across some of these terms. And the first of the conditions we said was the actual chain. So the first one, if a chain is defective, then the scholars of hadith go into the, where is the missing link? If it's broken anywhere, it's declared munqati. If the companion is missing, it's mursal. We looked at the word mursal earlier. We mentioned that mursal was in Imam Malik's collection, Muwatta, and we also looked at and so if there are two more links missing, it would be mu'dal. If it's missing at the end of the link, just before the collector, it's called mu'allaq. And then there's other things where there are some hidden defects, so called mudallas, is concealed, where somebody has done tadlis. They have not really revealed clearly who they narrated the hadith. They have given a kind of name, perhaps, of the person that they narrated the hadith from, but not the full name or the name they're popularly known by, or maybe they've missed them out. And there's also something called mu'an'an hadith, where we saw in that first example of hadith, beginning of it, might start hadathana, or some hadith start akhbarana. But if they don't start like that, if they start an means from, hadathana would mean he narrated to us, akhbarana, he informed us, an just means from, and so it's not clear what how the two people in the chain are actually connected. So so some people consider that mu'annan is only considered connected if it fulfills certain conditions, that the person does not do tadlis, that all the transmitters were contemporaries. And Imam Bukhari, for example, and his teacher Ali ibn al-Madini and other scholars, they add another condition, that the meetings between the narrator and the teacher must be conclusively established. Others say that such narrations, they're allowed unless they're proven otherwise. So different scholars will have different, if you like, conditions, strict conditions. Now, in terms of using Da'eef Hadith, so we can use the Sahih, we can use the Hasan, but the Da'eef, there is a restriction on what they can be used for, not for Aqidah, not for acts of worship. And this is the three conditions of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, famously. The Hadith must only have minor weaknesses. It must be in conformity with the general principles of the Sharia. And then the third condition is that the person does not believe it to be firmly established. So here is a hadith, for example, which many people will know about. He who preserves 40 hadith from my ummah and will be raised up on Yawm al-Qiyamah among the fuqaha, will be like a scholar. This hadith is weak. There are many chains reporting this hadith, but all of them are weak. And they're so weak that they cannot be used to support each other. So it cannot become Hasan li ghayrihi. So we can act upon this. If we're allowed to think to ourselves, I'll just memorize at least 40 hadith. What is not allowed is to actually believe that you will become a scholar on the Day of Judgment if you memorize 40 hadith. But as you can see, that they are used in some ways. Okay, and the last, if you like, category of hadith, they're not really hadith or Mawdu, and I think Dr. Dwan talked about the reasons for fabrication last time, and here's an example of one, and you can recognize the Mawdu hadith. Well, often the actual narrator admits to lying. Well, the narrator is caught lying, or there's something in the hadith which is which proves it to be fabricated, or contains overly exaggerated reward for certain actions, and this is a sort of classic example. And in fact, this hadith, I think, is actually like a famous one, because this was um, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal and his best friend Yahya bin Ma'in found someone who narrated this, and when they asked him where did you get this from, he said, I got it from Yahya and Ahmad. And Yahya bin Ma'in said, I'm Yahya and this is Ahmad. And he said, well, I got it from another Yahya and another Ahmad. So he was obviously found out to be fabricating hadith. So this is interesting. These numbers, they're just made up. They're not set in stone, but they might give you an idea of the range, if you like, within the classifications of Sahih, Hasan, and Da'eef. So if something is mutawatir, it has multiple chains of narration, you can be 100% confident in it. If it's something as Sahih, you could be pretty confident you can see, but there are levels within the Sahih because some people have had more stringent conditions than other scholars, and Hasan you could see slightly lower, and Da'eef you could see has a very wide range. Something can be only slightly weak, or actually very, very weak, so weak that 1% level of authenticity is practically Mawdu. So this might give you an idea that there are levels of authenticity. And some of the scholars have actually mentioned that that certain topics required more strenuous efforts at authentication than others. So even within the Sahih collections, the standards, if you like, for authenticity may have been dropped, or may have been loosened for hadiths that were for other than some of the core topics. So the core topics being ibadah and sharia and aqidah, but other topics to do with maybe asbab nuzul or sira maghazi did not have, they had less rigor in some ways. They did not impact the core of the and hadith about the end times. Perhaps they did not have as much rigor as the core topics, even though they are declared, even though the hadith might be sahih. So the ulama have actually given us, the muhaddithin have given us levels of sahih, and some of the chains are more superior than others, and we mentioned this previously on the talk before, also regarding the importance of women hadith narrators who are involved in some of these very, very important chains. So these are the levels of Sahih. If something is in Sahih Bukhari and also Sahih Muslim, then we said before this is called muttafaqun alayh, about 2,300 hadith of this. If it's Bukhari only, Muslim only, even though some people have said that different people have preferred the collection of Sahih Muslim to Sahih Bukhari. The majority of scholars have put Sahih Bukhari above. And this is also important when it comes to reconciling apparent conflicts. This is maybe something which can be covered, in a future talk about fiqh and ethics of disagreement. But when there's apparent conflicts with hadith, then these are some of the steps that the fuqaha might take. And there's a difference between the muhaddith and the faqih. And some people have said that muhaddith is like the pharmacist and the faqih is like the doctor. They apply they know which of the medicine to actually choose. But these are some of the methods we used. And the first is to harmonize the hadith. It might be clear in one context that there's two hadith. It's clear, this is in one context, this is another context. Or there might be an abrogation such that one hadith has come after another. So the one that comes after has abrogated the one before. Or the issue might be a preference that the ulama just prefer one hadith of another, and they give preference because of the inequality of the isnad or the content. So as we said before, those agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim are given precedence over Sahih Hadiths found in other books, and the Sahih Hadith in general are given preference over the Hasan Hadiths. And there are other methods of preference. And sometimes the issue can be actually unresolved. There is a hadith, there's an example of unresolved hadith in At-Tirmidhi. The Prophet ﷺ said that Surah Al-Hud and its sisters have made my hair grey. But some narrations said Abu Bakr said this, some narrations say this is a response to a question of Abu Bakr, and others say Aisha was asked. And so there are over 15 variations of this, and so it is perhaps sort of unresolved. So then we said at the beginning of this that you could actually rank the hadith collections. So the scholars have actually ranked the hadith collections, and so the top three, if you like, are Imam Malik's Muwatta, the Sahih Bukhari, and the Sahih Muslim. So we had that big collection earlier in an earlier slide, and the second rank would be the other Sahih Sitta. Not they're called Sahih Sitta not because they're all the hadiths in the Sahih Sitta, this collection. They're not all Sahih, but they have many of them are Sahih. But they're also ranked in a way. Sunan ibn Majah is the one which has the least, if you like, of authentic in terms of its collection. There are many hadith in there which are considered da'eef or even Mawdu. And there was some debate whether it was even in this collection of 6, and some people put other collections like Muwatta in the 6. And then there are so many other collections, and some scholars have given ranks of 4, maybe a 4th rank or 5th of all the different ranks of books. So these are all the words that we've covered today, and so these are some of the basic words that I hope if you can go over the slides, you should know these, and it's a very basic introduction to Mustalah Hadith. And all of what we mentioned regarding authenticity this is the first step to understanding a hadith. The next step is interpreting the meaning of that hadith and its application. And remember, a scholar would consider all relevant hadith on a particular subject. But you can see that the science is very deep and takes many, many years to become specialist in it. And it requires a level of intelligence and forensic analysis, which is very demanding, and we are massively indebted to the scholars of the hadith over the centuries, and it's been an amazing achievement for this Muslim ummah, a unique achievement. May Allah shower His mercy upon all of them. So I hope that this has been of some benefit, and I pray that we all increase our knowledge in these amazing sciences, and that we benefit from the knowledge that we have gained, and any mistakes in this are mine. And I leave you also with this slide. I put it in the pack when we send the emails, that you can look into this in a bit more detail, and also take benefit in some way. So any mistakes that I've made, I probably have made quite a few, and they're mine. So وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك وأشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت وأستغفرك وأتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر.